In this podcast, Tim OReilly from O'Reilly Media talks about data, jobs, and what's the future. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to Jobs of Future podcast. Today is a very special episode. I think today we have an awesome visionary and
Tim
awesome
OReilly from
guest
O'Reilly
on the
Media
show. That pretty much signifies that we're doing a
data,
good
jobs,
job. So,
and what's the future.
Tim OReilly from O'Reilly Media. Welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Great. So a brief bio for very few of us who didn't know about Tim. So Tim is the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media. His original business plan was simply interesting work for interesting people. And that's worked out pretty well. O'Reilly Media delivers online learning, publishes books, runs conferences, urges companies to create more value than they capture, and tries to change the world by spreading and amplifying the knowledge of innovators. Tim has a history of convening conversations that reshapes the computer industry. In 1993, he launched the first commercial ad-supported site on the internet. In 1998, he organized meetings where the term open source software was agreed on and helped the business world understand its importance. In 2004, with the Web 2.0 Summit, he defined how Web 2.0 represented not only the resurgence of the web after the dot-com bust, but a new model for the computer industry based on big data, collective intelligence, and the internet as a platform. In 2009, with his Gov 2.0 Summit, he framed a conversation about modernizations of government technologies that has shaped policy and spawned initiatives at the federal, state, and local levels. And around the world, he has now turned his attention to implications of AI and the on-demand economy and other technologies that are transforming the nature of work and the future shape of the business world. This is the subject of his forthcoming book from Harper Business, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. With that, Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Great. And by the way, thank you so much for keeping us all attuned and informed in how this world is shaping up. We have all been following almost every assets of O'Reilly Media, and they have sort of helped us stay on top of this technological curve. So why don't you walk us through your journey if I missed out anything in the description?
Yeah, no, I think you captured some of the highlights. Maybe the story I'll tell is one that may be of interest to people who have been sold the Silicon Valley story that, the innovation begins with entrepreneurs meeting up with venture capitalists who will fund their businesses. Because I started my business with $500. And it was funded not by VCs, but by customers. And I think that this, while we talk a lot in Silicon Valley about product market fit, there's still a bit of kind of a bad message that's being spread to entrepreneurs, which is that you need investors in order to start a business. Mm. And there are a lot of companies that get started with investors and never find customers. Whereas if you find a customer, you have a business from day one. Hmm. And so, I guess the part of the story I would like to emphasize is that even though I've been around Silicon Valley, I've participated in, a lot of the really interesting technology innovations, I've done it a different way. And I think it's super important because one of the messages in my book is that I've come to realize that the financialized economy, where people are measuring things by valuation, which is really the betting market about the future, is very different from the economy of real goods and services exchanged by people. And I think we need to rediscover that economy. Because if in fact, your goal is simply to maximize the value of a financial asset, a stock, rather than build a real company with relationships with customers, you can do it with the equivalent of fake news. You can, do stock buybacks. You can, spin a great story for investors that never comes true. And, a lot of what's wrong in our economy is there are a lot of people who are getting rich without actually creating value. And my company's mantra has always been create more value than you capture. And we came upon that as a motto after I was telling a story at a company meeting about how some internet billionaire had told me he'd started his company with an O'Reilly book, and I said, "Wow, we got $35. He got $1 billion. That's actually a pretty good deal. We created that value." And and then one of my people, Brian Irwin, said, "Yeah, we create more value than we capture," and every business should try to do that. And instead we see a lot of businesses where people are trying to capture more value than they create.
Interesting. And so where do you spend most of your time nowadays? Like what do you do now? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, I'm still the CEO of O'Reilly Media, although I'm not involved. I'm really acting more like executive chairman. Laura Baldwin, my president, COO, runs the company day to day. But I'm involved in, strategic decisions. Still spend some time, kind of advising on where our products are going. But mostly, I'm spending time out in the world. I'm doing a lot of speaking, writing. I go out and meet with people. And again, this does feed back into the work that we do at O'Reilly Media. As I learn interesting new things, it shapes our strategy. It shapes who we bring to our events, who we publish, and so forth. What technologies we cover. But I also spend a fair amount of time working on a nonprofit that I'm on the board of, and that was started by my wife, Jennifer Palka, which is called Code for America. And it's really an outgrowth of the work that I started doing around 2009 with Jen around how do we bring what we've learned in the technology industry to government. And it's turned out in the beginning, it was really about new technologies like cloud computing. But what we've really found through Code for America is what people need to learn is user-centered design more than anything else, and iterative development. So we kind of are preaching, data-driven, iterative, user-centered development, because there's so many cases where government programs fail because they actually never think about the implementation. And one of the great learnings of Silicon Valley has been how to develop products iteratively. And it's funny because, of course, if you're younger, you probably don't remember what software development was like before the internet. And, literally it was, this process, even in the, like on the PC, with Microsoft, it was a new release. If you were lucky, every year and a half, and sometimes not for 2, 3, 4 years. And the shift to continuous deployment. And I remember back, when we first started, kind of celebrating that around 2004 or 2005 as part of the Web 2.0 discussion, it was a revelation to people. I remember this guy, Mark Lukovsky, who'd been a senior guy at Microsoft. He went to Google and he was just sort of going, oh my God, I developed something and I push it live around the world the same day. And of course, now we know that companies are deploying with thousands of experiments, A/B tests. And yet, when you look at typical software development on behalf of governments, it is still, you have an RFP, which takes 4 or 5 years to develop, and then you have a 10-year contract guaranteeing that your technology is going to be far out of date. And so if you really, we want, and I think as a result, part of the results of that is we have less trust in government because, in fact, it's not keeping up with the experience that people have in the private sector. They're going, wow, I can buy something from Amazon and have it delivered the same day. Why does it take the VA 9 months to figure out that a discharged soldier actually worked for them and is eligible for benefits. Actually, I think it's 18 months. This is insane. Because they have not actually learned those lessons of how do you build things that are more responsive and data driven. But it's also about the user experience, where you understand what goes wrong in systems and how to fix them. You don't get it right the first time. And so anyway, I've been spending a lot of time, working on that, because I think it's a very important sector of our economy. And it goes hand in hand with the work I'm doing, trying to persuade policymakers to think differently about future work.
Interesting. And by the way, I do appreciate you for doing that. And thank you so much for such an awesome job there. I think I love that tagline of interesting work for interesting people. So creating interesting work for interesting people. So what is nowadays interesting work for interesting people? Like what's nowadays? You can define that as. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Well, there's so many areas that I find interesting. And I will say that I am, unlike a lot of people in Silicon Valley, I tend to be more interested in things that are pre-commercial than things that are commercial. And so when I say, wow, what do I find really fascinating these days? I go, okay, how about the thing that Ryan Phelan and Stuart Brand are working on, bringing extinct species back to life, with genetic engineering. That's freaking, it's kind of the crazy hacker ethos. It's not like the Silicon Valley startup, but it's the kind of thing where I go, wow, we are going to have to actually probably do genetic engineering on large scale to adapt to climate change. But it's also going to be one of the industries of the future. When you think about, biotech, and part of my experience has always been that despite this sort of mythology that it's all about venture capital, so many of the interesting things that I've been associated with started with hackers. The PC industry, it was like the Homebrew Computer Club, the World Wide Web. It was just all these people, and we were just going, wow, here's this free software. You can make these cool websites and share information with each other. It was free. It was easy. It was non-commercial. The maker movement. We started Maker Faire to celebrate what people were doing with hardware and new manufacturing and the Internet of Things. And in each case, it was pre-commercial when it was interesting. And it became interesting, obviously, on large scale. And it's not to say it isn't interesting once the money arrives, but I tend to be interested in spotting those areas that people are working at the edges. The other thing I find interesting are people who are working for more than a financial payoff. And a great example of this, which I talk about in my book, is a company called Zipline. While there was all this buzz about Amazon or Google competing on drone delivery, and I've actually been at a Google conference where I had a cup of coffee delivered by a drone. This is stupid. On the other hand, what Zipline is doing, it's a company from here in the Bay Area, but they're working in Africa. They're going, wow, we can use on-demand technology and drones to get blood anywhere in the country. And they started out working in, sorry, I'm having a what they call a brain fart. Anyway, they basically, they're going, okay, the leading cause of female mortality is postpartum hemorrhage. There's not developed hospital infrastructure. The roads are bad, but their clinics, they just don't have supplies of all the right blood types. We can get them. So they're covering the entire country. They've now made deals in 4 or 5 other countries. So they're using this technology to solve, hard new problems.
Interesting.
I'm also super interested in AI and how it's changing the world.
Interesting. And now let's get on the book. So, by the way, very clever title. Who come up with the name?
Well, it really grew out of a piece I wrote called the WTF economy, and which is a piece I wrote on Medium when I was starting my next economy summit, and I was trying to get across that there's these technologies that you can say WTF to, which can be a expression of amazement or an expression of dismay. And I like the kind of the edginess of that term, because the first time, like for example, I saw Uber, I was like, WTF, this is so cool, you can have a car. And then, of course, when you start seeing all the ways that they're not necessarily being good to their drivers, you say WTF in the other sense. And so I'm trying to explore that edge of WTF. I was doing it with this, thinking about technology and the future of work. And it got translated to what's the future as a result of a talk I gave at for President Obama. I was the warm-up act for this conference that in the waning months of the Obama administration, they did a conference called Frontiers at Carnegie Mellon, and it was focused on AI. And they asked me to come give a talk, about the impact of AI, and I wanted to call it WTF. And they said, "No, we can't do that." And I said to White House comms, "Just say it stands for what's the future." And they said, "Yeah, we can work with that." So they got it approved. And then, it just seemed like, what's the future was a good starting point. And part of the thing is the opening part of the book is really about how to think about the future. The book has 4 parts. And so it's really like not, this will happen, that will happen, here's what to expect. It's much more, so my original title was, what's the future and how to think about it. And my wife said, "No, that's a stupid title. The really important part of your message is the choices we have to make." She herself is writing a book called No One Is Coming, It's Up to Us. And she said, call it, what's the future and why it's up to us. Because it's really about the role of choice and this idea that entrepreneurs are effectively reinventing the world. This idea, a WTF technology, it creates that sense of WTF because it really is, it's unprecedented. It's something that, was unexpected. And so, like talking about back to Zipline, talking with Keller Ronaldo recently, he's talking about the people in Rwanda where they started this project. He said originally it was like, oh my God, what's this thing? This bird flying through the sky and dropping something. And now it's like they expect stuff shows up by drone. They go to the hospital and stuff comes by drone. It was WTF, and now it's the stuff of ordinary life. And I think it's super interesting because there's a set of technologies that are now going to come back to us from people who are out there pushing the boundaries. Anyway, the first part of the book is really focused on this. It's in some ways it's retelling some of my ancient history out of O'Reilly, some of the things you talked about in the introduction. How did I sort of frame the story of open source? How did I come up, move from open source to big data and Web 2.0? The idea of collective consciousness in the global brain as a key idea. These were ways of reframing and seeing things differently in stuff that everybody else was talking about, but kind of pattern recognition. So I kind of talk about the tools of how to do that. Also retelling some of the stories of my career in tech. How the role I played in persuading Amazon to think of themselves as a platform rather than an application, and so on. Because I was really focused on this idea that the internet really was becoming a platform. Everybody was still focused on the PC. So if you roll back the clock 20 years, everybody was focused on Linux as an alternative to Windows. And I was like, no. So that's the wrong way to think about it. And so this is the reason why I spent the first part of the book on that, was because I wanted to set up, okay, so what are we not seeing correctly today? And so I kind of then walked through the idea of platforms and how we need to change our perspective on what a business is. For example, this whole debate with on-demand companies are, Uber and Lyft drivers, employees, or contractors. I go, this is we're framing using the old metaphors. There's something new, and it's reflecting a way that humans are partnering with machines in new ways. And then I try to unpack that and draw some principles and lessons from that. And then the second half of the book is really focused on AI writ large, not on the technical details, but really, what does it mean to build an algorithmic system? Because of course AI is on the continuum with big data. And I try to do this through telling the stories of several different companies. I look at how Google search quality works. What does it actually mean to have an algorithm to be optimizing for something? And then I go on to Facebook and fake news and kind of get across the idea that we can have the wrong optimization. Facebook thought that showing people more of what they liked and responded to would bring people closer together. It ended up creating this hyper-partisanship and divisiveness. And Facebook is trying to fix their algorithm. And the reason I wanted to talk about that was because I then wanted to get on to the way that I think our economy is also guided by the wrong algorithm. And that's where I really get into the financial system as also a collective intelligence system like Google and Facebook. I try to introduce the term of hybrid artificial intelligence. The people are focused a lot on, well, when will an AI become independent of us? And I kind of go, it doesn't have to become independent of us to be harmful to us. And in particular, a lot of these systems are symbiotic systems. And I take some lessons from biology in there, because in fact, if you look at human beings or any animal, we're symbiotic organisms as well. We have a microbiome, all these bacteria that are part of our bodies. And in some sense, I say, well, maybe the future AI is a collective consciousness of human beings mediated by machines. We're the microbiome of this AI. And so we're already teaching it what to do. And, and so when you look at AI scare stories like Nick Bostrom's paperclip maximizer, or Elon Musk uses the idea of a strawberry picking robot that self-improving and eventually decides humans are in the way of strawberry fields forever. And I go, we already have one of those. It's called the shareholder value algorithm. We are literally telling our company, we are programming them. We are programming companies with the message that people are a cost to be eliminated. And so I'm kind of going, we want a different economy. We need to change the programming.
Interesting. And I think what I liked fascinating about your book, by the way, so typically I've read books in which you talk about this sort of either the dystopian future, or you talk about this glorious future, and pretty much very less context to the past. And I think what I liked about WTF in my journey had been how you sort of connected the two dots together. So you explain all the legacy system, how sort of you have grown into them, and then because I think culture is what most of the authors are missing today, to talk about that culture has a significant role in understanding the technology evolution. So that's why it's important and customary for us to understand. I think I commend you for sort of having a very good capture in sort of this scenario and walking us through, hey, this is what we have seen, this is what we are seeing, this is probably what could happen. So that's a very nice flow. We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Thank you. Well, again, I think we have some important choices to make as a society. And part of what I was trying to do was to bring in some history of when we've made good choices in the past and when we've made bad choices, and then and look both at the company level and at the overall national economy level. Because, for example, Microsoft made a bad choice when they took too much of the value from the PC ecosystem. I think Google has made bad choices. They're taking more of the value from the web ecosystem. And it's analogous to what's happening in our economy today, where companies are basically extracting value for their shareholders and leaving everybody else impoverished. And there's a narrative about, well, this is a good thing and it's just the way systems work. And I go, well, look, what technology teaches us is that when you optimize too much for one thing, you become brittle and you have to actually take more factors into account. And we actually have the capability today to build more robust, complex systems that take more factors into account. And we could have a future of enormous prosperity that's shared widely, or we can have a future in which few people are extremely prosperous and everybody else is worse off than they were without this technology.
Interesting. So what's the resolve? I think so. Typically, if you look at, and you yourself as you are a business owner, you understand the nuances of creating value for the shareholder. Like there are very few KPIs that has been created and given to an entrepreneur to sort of keep it secure and to sort of measure the success of its outcome. And then even the stock market has learned to appreciate those dynamics. And then that has helped sort of entrepreneur to raise more money or whatever. So what is your resolve? And I think I love the thought, like one side of me says, yes, you want to create more value. But the other side also says that, hey, you need to create more value for the shareholders because who are backing you at. So what's the resolve you would suggest?
So the way I think about it is when you're building a system that has depends on multiple resources, you really want to reward the resources in proportion to their contribution. And obviously, let me take a very extreme case. Here's Apple, the most profitable company in history. They, if their customers left them, they'd be screwed. If their employees left them, they'd be screwed.
True.
If their suppliers left them, they'd be screwed, right? If the government failed to provide the rule of law, they'd be screwed. If their shareholders all abandoned them, except for the psychological, kind of like shock value of Apple stock, it wouldn't matter at all, because the value that Apple produces is in selling stuff to customers. They make so much money. I mean, they do use financial market. They don't get anything from investors. Those investors are just trading among themselves, betting on Apple's future. And so Apple could literally even make up the money they give to their employees in the form of stock options out of their cash.
Interesting.
And now that is an extreme case. Now, in looking at another extreme, you have financial markets working correctly. When people are, say, investing in Tesla or even Amazon up to the past decade, in the first decade or and a half, it was like this company would not have existed without investors. So investors deserve an enormous return because they're betting on something that's unproven. And then there's a set of companies, I think too many today in Silicon Valley, that will never produce value except through this betting market. They're really financial instruments. They're just bets. And I've started to actually compare them more to movies than to companies. They're kind of, it's like, people enjoy betting on them. And some people win and some people lose, but it's really just it's part of the gambling. Maybe it's not movies. It's like the gambling industry. Like, okay, is this stock going to win? Is this horse going to win? So it's like horse racing. So it's not real. It's an economic activity, but not a terribly productive one. And Two things are sort of mixed in together. And the question is, can you disentangle them? And I think there's some things when you think about, when I think about policy, I tend to think about how would we do policy if we were a tech platform? And you think about the issues that Google has to deal with in search, or that Facebook is trying to sort through in fake news. There's a lot of signals that tell you whether something is being developed for to be a real business, or whether it's just for people to bet on. And part of it has to do with the plausibility of its real business model. And you see this right now in the cryptocurrency space. It's this huge betting speculative bubble, and then small places where there's companies going, oh, we actually know what we're going to do with this. I think about Ripple, for example. Ripple is like, hey, we're doing cross-border, we're a payments company. We just happen to be using crypto to do this thing with lower friction than the antiquated systems that were built 50, 60 years ago. So they're a real business. And and part of the job of the market is to tell which are real businesses. When you look at an investor like Warren Buffett, that's why he was so good. He would look at things and go, this is a good business, this is a bad business. And right now we just have a kind of a market that's become so enamored of the betting, and they're not even trying to figure out if it's a real business or not. They're just trying to go, is it a good bet? And can I get out before before it it pays off? And I think there's some tax policy things that I think we could do that would reward real investment. Like if you had much longer holding period for capital gains, then you can't just be in the bet. You have to wait till the bet finishes. Like one example of this is, if you think about the idea of a stock price being the the net present value of the future earnings of the company, and it's a bet on what that's going to be, there is a time when it equalizes. So I've been doing some research since the book, and I've been looking at Amazon versus Google. And it's quite interesting. If you look at how much Larry and Sergey are worth, in the stock market, and then you look at Google's collective, 20 years of profit history, and you go, well, what would their share of the retained profits be? They'd actually be have about the same amount of money. So in other words, the bet paid off. Now Jeff Bezos, everybody's talking about, wow, Jeff is the richest person in the world. Well, what if it were a private company without financial markets? What would Jeff be worth? Well, he'd still be a billionaire, but his share of the money that Amazon has made over the years would be 1.5 billion, not 150 billion or 200 billion, whatever his current number is. So he's got this huge leverage. So his bet has not actually paid off for the investors yet.
Interesting.
And it's paid off in the betting market, but it hasn't paid off in that equalization market. And I think, if you took that into account and you said, okay, once a company, we're going to have one tax policy for when people are betting, and another one for when they're actually. So again, there's two kinds of betting. One is a bet on something that doesn't exist yet. So we're betting on Amazon's future prospects when it's uncertain, and then there's a bet on Apple's future prospects when it's super successful. And again, it's like still a bet. It's a good bet, but it's not an investment anymore. It doesn't make Apple possible. And so I think, just disentangling those two ideas of this is purely a financial speculation versus this is financial speculation towards building something that would not exist. Could we, in fact, be smart enough in our algorithms to know the difference and have different tax policies? I think we could. Just like we're expecting Facebook to figure out, oh, wait, that's fake. That's clickbait. That's a hard, nuanced problem too. But we kind of don't hold our policymakers up to the level of sophistication that we routinely expect of our tech companies today.
Interesting. I think that's fascinating. And one more area where I want to pick your brain on is I think you partially covered in your book is about around how the work is shaping up over the time.
Yeah.
And I think even in your company's case, you have been part and parcel in sort of educating us what's happening, what's upcoming, what's going to happen. And from if you wear your CEO hat of O'Reilly Media, how do you see the learning landscape change as sort of, because nowadays every now and then we hear about a keyword that we have not heard before, and I think back in 90s and 80s we get enough time to learn. And I was talking to one of the senior executive at one of the retail company, and he was saying that, Vishal, when the shelf life of a skill is shorter than the amount it takes you to learn it, everything just throws out of the window. So it's getting more challenging in preparing us in this rapidly evolving world. What are some of your thoughts there?
I guess what I would say about that is that for those people who live on the edge of innovation, that has always been the case. The world's not moving any faster today if you're a real innovator than it was, 20 years ago or 30 years ago. In the early web, it was, you had to learn new skills all the time, and that was what people do. The issue today is that there were a bunch of companies where you didn't have to do that. That was for the fringe kids, and so it's like a little bit. It's sort of like the real innovators and entrepreneurs get to say to everybody else, welcome to our world. And in some sense, the kinds of things that our customers at O'Reilly have always done, which is continuous learning. Something now, it's like you just have to say to people, it's not good enough to go to school and learn something and practice it for the rest of your career. You have to be learning all the time. And I guess in one sense we have some advantages in that world, because that's what we've been doing for our entire business, is educating people in a just-in-time way. As people are doing, it's learning to do. That's the other thing. So much of what's happened in our world is people are trying to do things, and you learn the skills as you need them in order to accomplish something. And I think it's a way of learning that a segment of the population has, lived with, forever, and it's a small segment, and now it needs to be a much bigger segment.
Interesting. And I think another interesting trend that I have seen over the time. So we as humans, we are either paid for our intelligence or for our labor. Like with this robots and sort of these mechanical capabilities, the labor part is shrinking, and sort of now we're relying more on the intelligence part. But I think over the last couple of decades, we have been closely aligned with technologies that we use in our day-to-day lives, right? So that means even the definition of intelligence is changing, even for human as well as the robots. And now we are sort of somewhat more intertwined with our sort of robot friends or our sort of algorithmic friends that we are using, whether it's a cell phone, whether it's a Facebook, whether it's whichever application. So in your perception of the future, what would you anticipate? Like, where would this humanity would lead us? And what would be sort of one of the and I think you talked about these two sort of ways of one of the dystopian view and one is sort of a more hopeful view. What's your take on that?
Well, the first thing I would say is, yes, what people get paid for changes over time. And, in some sense, we're always paid for our labor, whether it was physical labor or intellectual labor. But the kind of things that we define as work and that we pay for and that we value shift. And, how many teachers were there in the Middle Ages? There were not that many, right? And then we had universal, education and a lot more teachers. Now, of course, we didn't value it enough. So I guess that there's a couple of things. When I think about the future of work, I think about three different things. The first is all this stuff that we're not getting to. And the first thing we have to do is stop thinking about jobs, which are this construct of the way we've organized the economy, and start thinking about work and ask ourselves, is the way we've structured our businesses and our economy helping us to do the work or not? And so I look around and I say, okay, our infrastructure's for shit. We're not investing in people, because an economy is fundamentally about the lives of the people in it, right? So this idea that somehow the robots are going to do all the work, why? Right? We have to figure out, well, what happens? So I guess I would say, what happens if the machines do more of the work? There's two paths, and one is we put a lot of people out of work. We have a society with a lot more misery, a lot more political instability, or we have a system where we go, oh, let's start paying for things that we need more of, that's real work, that is not currently valued. And you think about, for example, the entire caring economy. Particularly as we have aging populations. We look at a lot of women decide, I can't afford to have children. And you kind of go, well, if we value having people, then we go, oh, we ought to really pay for care. And we pay for it not necessarily, well, your job is to raise your child, but when you think about something like Mark Zuckerberg modeling, I'm going to take 3 months off when I have a new baby, and this universal parental leave, that's a step towards effectively paying for part of the caring economy. But you could also think about it in other ways. How do we support the kind of human economy that we want? How are we going to spend our productivity? There's a great line from Mary Oliver. She said, how will you spend your one wild and precious life? We have this life. We're building all these amazing tools for productivity, and we have a small set of people who are hoarding that, the benefits, and instead of making the world a better place. So, and I think a big part of it is going to be in this area of finding ways. Some of them will be hacks. In his forthcoming book, AI Superpowers, Kai-Fu Lee talks about what he calls a social investment stipend. It's like, rather than universal basic income, we just say, hey, we'll provide, kind of an income, but you're expected to do something for it. And it might be caring for your aged parent. It might be you're raising kids. It might be that you're teaching. It might be that you're volunteering. But you'll do something to improve, our human condition, and that's what we're paying it for. And that's sort of an interesting, approach. Another approach is, compulsory public service of some kind. There's a lot of things that have been done over the years. There's also another way that I think historically people have been taken out of the workforce is through education. And it's like we went from universal childhood education to high school to college, and now you go, well, what if there was just sort of a stipend for people to take 20% time to learn new skills, and you got paid to do that? We have the productivity to fund that, and it would both reduce the working hours and give people the time to be learning those new skills. It's a different way of thinking about it than just, well, we'll just get rid of these people because we don't need them. No, we'll have them be working 3 days a week. We'll have them be learning 2 days a week, or we'll have them be working 3 days a week. We'll have them be learning 1 day a week, and we'll have them be taking care of family and their lives and other people. There's a lot of different ways to think about it, and I do think that our sort of focus. Anyway, that's one piece, and the other, of course, is the creative economy. You know, and I think one of the themes that runs through my book is this thing that Clay Christensen called the law of conservation of attractive profits. That when one thing becomes a commodity, something else becomes valuable. And that was how I got from open sources commoditizing software. Big data is going to become valuable, and I think but there's also another way when you look at it in a broad economic sense. Think about something like, food. Food became cheap, it became a commodity, and we found ways to make it valuable. This isn't just, bread. This is gluten-free bread, or this is organic. This is farm-to-trade coffee. This is, farm-to-table food. This is fair trade coffee. They're basically, we've added ideas into food to make it valuable again. And I think that's part of the creative economy writ large. And I think when I think with my policy head on, I say, we need to look at what kind of policy supports that creative economy. So we say, oh yeah, we want more craft beers. We don't want the big monopolistic commodity beer makers to put the small craft beers out of business.
True.
That's the kind of monopolistic behavior. So that's the one thing. And then the last one really is just this going back to all the work that needs doing. I think here in the U.S. we've really lost our appetite for big hard things in a lot of ways. And you look at what China is doing with One Belt, One Road. Investing in infrastructure around the world. This is like the Marshall Plan on steroids. And they're building the economy of the future while we're just kind of living in the economy of the past.
Interesting. No, I think that's a very interesting point. And I think one thing that I can recall, I was talking to one of the struggling retail executive, and he was talking to me about sort of shrinking his IT core, and we were discussing about this idea of, and it was sort of terrifying to hear that how much pressure they get. So getting a good talent is very, very hard. And I think you talked about this creative economy, right? They are creative people coming from their diverse backgrounds, sort of getting their value to the business. And it's financially, it's very sort of motivating for businesses to do more with less, and sort of give it to automation. On the other side, so they have more pressure to let loose of these creative assets rather than training these guys. So what's your take?
Well, I think that's really this flawed objective function in our economy. We are telling companies to optimize for their stock price, and so much money can be made by the people at the top of a company by playing financial games that they don't invest in the real business. Now, look at something like Toys R Us, which went out of business recently. If you look at Toys R Us, a huge part of what put them out of business, it was not competition from Amazon. It was the fact that there was a bunch of financial engineering where they, have been one leveraged buyout firm after another, taking on massive amounts of debt, trying to basically flip the stock and, basically take advantage of, a financial opportunity. Same thing with newspapers. They're not as profitable as they used to be. Newspapers used to be a way to make a fortune. And, I look at how much money I make in my company, and I've done very well on margins that newspapers went out of business on, right? Because they were basically going, they built, as they started to shrink, they went, oh, we have to keep growing. So they buy, they do these big roll-ups, in hopes that and they take on lots of debt, and the debt service is what sunk them, not their business. You can live on a 10% margin, even if you once had a 30% margin. It's not like the end of the world. And it's so funny because you look at Amazon, which grew with retailers' margins of 2 or 3% until they found cloud computing. But businesses get fat and sassy and used to a particular level of profit, and then they try to maintain it through financial games, and then it's the financial games that sink them, rather than going, this is not a business that's as good as it used to be, but it could still be a perfectly good business.
Interesting. So what would you suggest these media companies do? Like what would you tell to their boards?
Well, I think invest in your people, invest in your customers, and accept that some things that you used to do may not work anymore. I mean, there's this old Hawaiian proverb: "Nobody promised us tomorrow." I look at my business. In the 90s, we were primarily a book publishing company, and we were quite successful at it. Book publishing fell off a cliff in 2000. Dot-com bust, never recovered. It kind of actually flattened out for the first time this year, but every year less than the year before. We adapted. We had started our conference business, and we've grown that enormously. We launched Safari as an originally online ebook platform, but eventually an online learning platform. Today, publishing is 20% of our business. Events is 30%, and Safari is over half. And you kind of go, we have adapted. We basically found new things. We said, well, we're not a publishing company. We're a knowledge company. We're a learning company. How do we bring, what do we do for people? And, we said, we can bring them together in person. Now, a lot of publishing companies have now come around after the fact to go, we should be an events company too. But we just did it because we were focused on our customers. What can we do for them? And I think that, companies think they deserve to be able to stay doing what they used to do. And, one of the things you learn is that, it's funny because as publishing was declining and ebooks were taking over, I was quite bullish on ebooks, and there were all these publishers like, the sky is falling. They weren't, it's like I looked at what was happening and I said, the way the ebook market is taking off, there's going to be these new intermediaries that are offering pennies on the dollar. We can't accept those terms. So I launched Safari because I said, we have to have a business model that will actually allow us to survive, because if I think this is going to be the future, I got to invest in it. And I have to build a business model that works. So we did. And other people were like, we don't want to deal with it. The future, you have to embrace the future and you have to go for it. And you might lose, but if you sort of go after it, you at least have a chance of succeeding. And part of another thing that I like to say is, make the choices that you won't regret, even if you lose.
Interesting.
It's like if you do something that makes the world a better place, and you didn't succeed, that's okay too. So many things that I've started, other people have gone on and done more with than I have, and I go, great. We created more value than we captured. We created the first commercial website. And we saw how much money was going into it. I wanted to keep my company private, so I sold it. I said, we're not going to win, but we showed the way, and now all these other companies get that this is a real market, and more power to them. And same thing with ebooks. We launched Safari in 2000. The Kindle didn't come along for 7 more years, but we showed the way to publishers that there was a viable market in ebooks. It wasn't the end of the world. It wasn't going to be that everything was going to be free.
Interesting. And so, about you, like what has helped you sort of stay successful? Like what are some of the ingredients that has really helped you stay relevant and successful through this turbulent, because you have seen some of the starkest turbulent ups and downs in media business and still existed. So what's your thoughts?
Well, I think a big part of it is I don't think that much about money. I mean, actually, it's funny. I do think about money, but in a different way than I think a lot of the kind of what I consider the fake entrepreneurs, who are kind of looking for the exit. One of the things I like to say is, money in a business is like gasoline in your car. When you take a road trip, you're not taking a tour of gas stations. You're going to stop at them to get the gas, but you're going somewhere. Where are you going? What are you focused on? And I've always been focused on trying to, again, we say that our business is fundamentally about changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. So we try to find people who are doing cool things that other people ought to know about, and we try to share what they're doing. And we then try to figure out ways to get paid so that we can keep doing it. Just like you try to figure out where the next gas station is so you can actually get, to Arches Monument or the Grand Canyon or whatever, which is where you're really going. And, we're going to, we're going to a future of AI. Where are we going, and what are the gas stations that will let us get there?
Interesting. So what is your thought on the role of AI in particularly your industry, and how do you see it sort of shaping your business or your side of the business?
Well, just in general, I like, there's a new book called Prediction Machines, which it really has a very down-to-earth approach to AI. It's just like, hey, this is a better way of making predictions. And every business needs to make predictions, and trying to understand how that applies, whether you're a retailer or developing products or building information services, super important. But I think so that's one piece of it. The other piece of it, though, is really this idea that's fairly central to me, which is that the role of technology is to augment people so they can do things that used to be impossible. So, and this is something I talk about in the book. If you look at an application like Uber or Lyft, one of the things that it teaches us is how technology creates jobs when it enables people to do something they couldn't do before. To be a taxi cab driver before, you had to be able to buy a medallion, or you end up working for someone who had one. You had to learn your way around, right? Which was pretty complex. They talk about the knowledge of the streets and monuments of London, one of the most difficult exams in the world. And suddenly you realize the capabilities that were in people's smartphones. Not only could you get anywhere, anybody could just drive for Uber or Lyft because the app knows how to get anywhere. And it vastly increases the range. You don't just have a little local area that the driver will only go to because that's all they know. And then you also have this amazing ability to match up passengers and drivers in real time. That's an augmented worker. And so one of the things that I think that companies need to figure out is, what is it about your business that you can augment? And it's sort of funny because I'm not always, it's not always easy, but you think about in any business there are probably many small augmentations. How do you become an augmented salesperson? What are the tools that allow you to be more effective? Well, you probably get good at using LinkedIn. You get good at using Salesforce. And those tools allow you to do things you couldn't do before. You learn the tools of social media if you're a marketer. Those are augmentations. And the tools of big data and analysis. All of these things. So predictive analytics around what's going to succeed and what doesn't. Getting smarter about seeing what's working and what's not working in your business, and learning that faster than the competition.
Interesting. And if I'm an individual trying to sort of navigate through this tech minced world that I'm heading in, what would you suggest I should do? Like, what would be your 2 cents for individuals? How I can stay relevant in this economy?
Well, I believe the first and most important thing that you have to do is have things that you care about.
Hmm.
The Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu has this great line. He says, caring is the invincible shield from heaven against being dead. and
Well said,
it's like,
yeah.
it's like that's how you get sort of power in yourself, as opposed to, like, so many people, we have this idea that a job is something you get from someone else. And when you can't get a job, you're helpless. And the entrepreneurial attitude is, there's something that needs doing. Let me go do it. And I always think back, this is a memory probably from the early, it was the late 70s, I think. I lived in Watertown, Massachusetts, and it was this old Italian grandfather who was living next door. And I watched him out my kitchen window, and he was building something. And it turned out to be a grindstone, pedal-powered grindstone. He sat there, and then he started making wooden spoons. And, and that sort of stuck with me, that image of like, okay, this guy doesn't know how to be idle. And I thought about that once I was going into some talk about entrepreneurship, and there was a homeless person knitting hats out on the street outside the place I went in. And then there are all these people, and their definition of entrepreneurship is, I'm looking for someone to give me investment so I can start a business. And I said, look, there's a guy outside who's more of an entrepreneur than you are, right? He's just taking his, he's basically out there saying, here's where I am, here's what I have, here's what I can do, where I am. He's not looking for, well, I can only do this thing if somebody gives me the handout.
I think that's a beautiful story. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like, so taking control of what you want to do and trying to do it, and again, so when I think about how I started my business, all of these things were unproven. It was just like, we had a tech writing consulting company. We were out of work, and it was like, well, what do we do when nobody's paying us? Well, let's find something useful. Oh, there's no book on VI, the Unix Tech Center. Let's write one. Oh, there's no book on UECP, the Unix networking protocol. Let's write one. And so we took the skills that we had, we did things that were needed, and then we went out there and we said, let's try selling these things, and we sold them for $5 originally, and I still remember when I have my book on managing UECP, which is this long dead technology, and somebody basically, this is in the days before the internet, and somebody calls up long distance, which was quite expensive, from Germany, and they asked me to DHL them a copy. And so I went, wow, they just paid $80 probably when I add up all the costs for me to ship a copy of this $5 book, to Germany. I go, oh wow, we're underpricing these things. I was like, people were like, how do I get this stuff to work? And then we kind of fell into this world where there was all this technology that people were struggling with, and we went, wow, it was just like, look anywhere. What are the tools that there's no documentation for? Let's write these books. And so we fell into that business. And then we fell into the conference business because we were like, wow, there's all this free software. There's nobody marketing it. Let's do some conferences to market it. And, and again, turn it into a good business. But it was by starting with, oh, there's this problem. What can we do about solving it?
Interesting. And you are in a business of giving us amazing books to read. Like, what are some of your favorite books you could list for us?
You mean that I'm reading right now?
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. I am actually, here's a book I just ordered. I haven't read it yet, but it's one that I heard about. called The Long 20th Century. And it's really about the relationship between big financial business models and the economy. So I'm really interested in economics, and I'm trying to learn a lot more about it. A book I love that I read recently was called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. It's really about this idea of rather than thinking about growth going up and to the right, we have to actually start thinking about effectively the economy as having a habitable zone, kind of like, the Earth is in the habitable zone around the sun. And, it's like economic undershoot. People don't have enough to eat. They don't have shelter. They don't have healthcare. They don't have opportunity, education, economic overshoot, climate change. It's like, hey, the job of economics is to keep us in that donut, which is this habitable zone. Sort of her image for that. And I like, it fits a lot with my ideas about AI and its ability to help us manage complex systems. I loved Kai-Fu Lee's AI Superpowers, which doesn't come out till September. That was really, really good. As I mentioned, this book, Prediction Machines, which I think is a great view of AI for business people. Another book that I've read recently that has not come out yet is a book by Anand Giridharadas called Winners Take All, The Elite Charade of Changing the World. And it's going to be a very controversial book, I think, because he rips kind of organizations like the Aspen Institute and TED, the whole sort of motivational speaker industry, and really this idea that that you can basically take so much from the world and then give a little back and you're okay. It's like, okay, we actually have, we sometimes may need more fundamental change to build a just world. And he really has some, I think, some profound and provocative insights that we really need to engage with. I like that book a lot. I'm thinking, I'm looking at a book, I haven't read it yet, but a book called New Power by Henry Timms and Jeremy Hyman's. I've been meaning to read. I've been also trying to reach out across the aisle, and I'm very progressive. I recently met the head of sort of right-leaning libertarian think tank called R Street, and he recommended this book to me, Seeing Like a State, which is basically how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed, which is the argument against government intervention. And I go, okay, I want to read books that challenge how I think about it. I actually think that government intervention, while it can go wrong, just like corporate intervention can go wrong, has been a force for good. I'm also reading a book that I have started to read a long time ago and then lost my copy of and just got another one. It's called The Struggle for Survival, which is about the industrialization of America in response to World War II. It has one of my favorite lines ever, which applies to so much. Because a victory small enough to be organized is too small to be decisive. And I love that because it really gets across this idea that, sometimes to tackle really big problems, you need just change of mindset, which causes everyone to rise up. And it really is the way we expect markets to work. But markets can also go wrong. And it fits with my own idea of markets, which is that right now our markets are sort of obsessed with the trivial, while there are huge problems like climate change and global health that are not being dealt with. And we actually need a change of mindset in order to catalyze that, that great victory, that is going to be too big to be organized, but big enough to actually be decisive.
That's pretty stark. Very, very cool. So, thank you so much, Tim. I think this is really, really useful. So, as a parting statement, if you want our listeners and viewers to take away something from this conversation, what would that be? Like, what would be your closing thought to our listeners and viewers?
Well, I guess the same thing I've been saying all along, which is try to leave the world a better place than you found it.
Beautiful. Well said. And I think, and one thing I would like to emphasize to our listeners and viewers who have not yet read Tim's book, this is the living. I think I was having chuckles with the conversation because I was coming in as a curious reader, and the way you were tackling sort of my curiosity was pretty much the living embodiment of that book. So I do appreciate you for sort of walking me through this journey of how it all came together. And thank you so much, Tim, for your time. I do appreciate you coming here. Always welcome back on the podcast. And whenever you're in Boston, let me know. Love to hang around with you and have a cup of coffee or tea. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a